Um, for those of you, well, you're all St. Paul Audubon members, so welcome. This is the second month of our virtual meetings. Alex and Karen both work at Friends of Mississippi River, and the program they're doing tonight is about this major conservation project near Elk River, which is on the Elk River. 325 acres of restoration, 180 acres of that I think was soybeans, and now it's turned into prairie. And this started in 2016, I believe, the negotiations with the owners of the farm, family-owned farm, and the city of Elk River, and there's other partners involved. Many of us go up to Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge to do birding, and Elk River is almost there, right? So this is an opportunity to see a new location, and there's already grassland birds that have moved into this new prairie. You saw the pictures, I think, online, the before and after, the soybean row crop, and then the aerial of the new prairie. So let me tell you a little bit about our two speakers. Karen Schick is a senior ecologist, and she's been working for 30 years in the environmental field. She has a BS in biology and a MS in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota. She's been working at FMR since May of 2000, and she works with prairie, savanna, woodland, wetland, stream bank, and lakeshore projects, ranging in size from a few hundred square feet to several hundred acres. So that's pretty much every habitat type in the state of Minnesota, I think. And she also does environmental education and classroom science instruction. And she develops natural resource management plans. She manages restoration projects for FMR. And she does plant and bird surveys. So she's not only an ornithologist, but she's also a botanist. And I know this from personal experience because I have been volunteering with FMR on different seed collection projects and buckthorn projects. And she's a good resource for identifying any plants. And I don't know a whole lot of plants, although I've been asking the question many times, what is that one? What is that one? She also leads restoration volunteer programs. Now, Alex Roth has a PhD in buckthornology. That's what I call it. It's actually it's from the forest ecology in the Natural Resources Science and Management from the U of M. And he also has a minor in risk analysis for invasive species and genotypes. So he has a lot of experience in both research and land management. And he's worked before for the Ohio EPA, the University of Notre Dame, and the Nature Conservancy. With FMR, he has a whole bunch of varieties of projects. He surveys natural communities, he writes natural resource management plans, designs restorations, oversees contractors, and he helps with volunteer projects as well. And he establishes citizen science monitoring programs. So welcome to both of you. This should be very interesting. And as Ben said, there's a chat. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can type it in. And there should be time at the end to address the questions. So I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gordon. I'll get started here. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. It was a lovely day today and has that summery feel in the air, but you know what? I've been seeing juncos for the last few days. So I guess winter is coming after all. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started here, and I'm hoping that no flies show up. And I'm going to start with, I will give just a little introduction about FMR, kind of who we are and what we do. And then I'll pass it off to Alex, and he'll be your tour guide for the tour of the Houlton property. And then I will come back and talk a little bit about the breeding bird survey, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. So to start us off here, FMR is now 27 years young. We have a staff of about 19. Our geographic scope actually follows the 72-mile corridor of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, your national park here in the Twin Cities area. And that's actually why we got started, because the founders of our organization felt there needed to be a citizen's voice for the river and for the national park portion. So that's how we came about. And I was just going to say also that our focus is not just on the river, but also on the watershed around it. So as you may be aware, the Mississippi River is a globally significant migratory bird flyway, and an often repeated statistic you may have heard: 40% of all North American waterfowl use the flyway, and 60% of all North American bird species use the Mississippi River corridor. So it's home to numerous other wildlife species as well. It provides drinking water for some 18 million people in the United States, and it provides endless recreational opportunities for countless human beings. So we consider it a very important place. And it's one that FMR strives to improve for our stretch of the river. Next, Alex. So we have 4 program areas to help us achieve our goals, as those are shown here. And I'll go through a few examples of each of our projects in these different areas. So one of the most significant projects for the River Corridor program was developing the critical area rules for the DNR. And cities up and down the Mississippi River in the metropolitan area must follow these rules as they pursue their development plans. So that's been a really important. Right now, we're working on the project of the Upper Harbor Terminal and promoting engagement with the North Minneapolis and other communities nearby. Our water quality program works with government agencies and legislators to develop policies to protect and improve the water quality, such as the riparian buffer width. And currently the big project is the Forever Green initiative for having perennial crops and helping to reduce runoff and erosion that way. Our stewardship program engages over 4,000 people every year at over 150 events, including classroom activities where students learn about water resources, and all of our volunteer stewardship events. And then we have our land conservation program, which I'll talk about more in just a moment. And we're focused on protection and restoration, and with special targets on things like pollinators and birds of conservation need and things like that. So our conservation program, our land conservation program, consists of 3 people. We have our conservation director, Betsy Daub, Alex, and me. And together we have helped to protect nearly 3,000 acres of land at 45 sites, and we have restored about 2,500 acres of land. So the first step that we do in our land conservation process is to identify the important areas that need protection. And typically these are areas that are either on the Mississippi River or they're connected to it one way or the other, either through another tributary or across the landscape. We then work with the landowners and with many agencies and organizations to achieve the permanent protection. So since 2000, we have been actually instrumental in getting land, 3 scientific and natural areas and 2 DNR wildlife management areas established. And those are Pine Bend Bluffs, SNA, Hastings-St. Cooley, SNA, the Chimney Rock, SNA, and then Gore's Wildlife Management Area and Hampton Woods Wildlife Management Area. And then after we get the areas protected, there's many other properties that we're working on as well. And after the protection, we develop the natural resource management plans, and then we seek funding for doing the restoration. So here are most of our active restoration sites. There's about 30 of them right now. Most of them are located between Minneapolis and Hastings. You see most of them all kind of clustered down there together. But there is one site that outlier site way up in Elk River, and that's the Houlton property. And that is what Alex is going to talk about. So I will pass you off to him now.
All right, thanks, Karen. Can everybody hear me? Maybe give some nods if you can. Okay.
I can hear you.
So as Karen said, my name is Alex Roth. I'm FMR's other ecologist, and I am going to be kind of leading this virtual tour through the William H. Houlton Conservation Area and covering our restoration efforts there over the past 5 years. So Gordon introed this a little bit. This is a 335 acre property that's right at the confluence of the Elk and the Mississippi rivers. So we've got both Mississippi and Elk River frontage. It's in Elk River proper, which is in Sherburne County. And as Karen mentioned, it's really our furthest north FMR restoration site. So we have been working at the Houlton Conservation Area since about 2014, when FMR and a few other organizations like the Trust for Public Lands came together to purchase and protect the property, which we then deeded to the city of Elk River, and they operate the property as a conservation area. And since then, FMR has brought over $700,000 in funding from the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, also the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Fund, to conduct the restoration at the property. And you can see I've kind of divided this up into the 3 phases of restoration that are occurring there. The first phase, which we secured funding for in 2015, was initially to fund the creation of a natural resource management plan to guide that restoration, and then to tackle about 90 acres of forest restoration. The second phase, which is still going strong for 1 more year, was quite a bit of money to convert the ag field, about 160 acres, plus another 20 acres of degraded grasslands to native prairie and savanna. And then the third phase, which has about 2 more years left on it, is restoring the remaining forest acres on the property. So I mentioned that first phase, the first step once we had protected the property, and Karen sort of covered this in the how-to of FMR's restoration process, was to create that natural resource management plan. And we need a plan that helps us guide the restoration, just so that we're not doing things willy-nilly out there. And, you know, Karen and I write these for every single site that we restore. It's a document that includes everything from pre-settlement vegetation and historical context to current conditions where we're surveying soils, water, vegetation, wildlife. And I'll show you a couple examples of maps that are produced and included in these plans. So when we're talking about historical context or pre-settlement vegetation, the map on the left shows what the Houlton property was like in the 17 and early 1800s prior to European settlement. And you can see the black outline of the property boundary right in the middle of the property there. And you can see that it actually goes across multiple vegetation types. So the southern portion of the property was largely river bottom forest along the Mississippi River. The rest of the property was located within the region that they call oak openings and barrens, which we consider as oak savanna. So a mix of large bur oak trees interspersed with native prairie. And then as an example of more of the current condition evaluation, we look at a lot of aerial photos. We obviously are out on the property surveying vegetation and wildlife. But we look both on the property and in the vicinity of the property to get an idea of how this property interfaces with other important natural areas. So the map on the right, you can see there's that light green background in which the property sits, and that background is metro conservation corridors. So we have this system of natural corridors that FMR, the DNR, and a variety of other organizations came together to delineate to help us prioritize conservation efforts in the Twin Cities Metro. So you'll see that most of FMR sites fall within these corridors, and the Houlton Conservation Area is no exception to that. But also you'll see all these other colored polygons, and those are denoting sites of high biodiversity significance as surveyed by the Minnesota County Biological Survey. So the dark green sections are really high biodiversity sites. Then it sort of drops down to green sites, to moderate sites in orange, and to sites that are surveyed but don't meet the biodiversity criteria. So you can see on the Houlton property, we don't have any areas that meet those high value criteria, largely because the property has been in agricultural production for over a century. But you'll notice that we do have a couple properties just south of the Houlton farm that are both ranked as high and moderate in biodiversity significance. So we can kind of help ourselves create a better mosaic of connected corridors of high quality habitat. And so when we combine that historical context with the current conditions, that helps us create our target plant communities and really our roadmap for restoration. So that includes task tables, cost estimates, so that we can really have a detailed plan in place to carry out restoration. So on this map, you're seeing an aerial of the property that's overlain with different target plant communities and different work units. And you'll notice that the units 1, 2, and 3 actually line up with those phases of grant funding that I mentioned earlier. So that first unit, unit 1, is all the forests around the periphery of that ag field. And we have a variety of different target communities for those forests. And then unit 2, the hatched area in the center, is that 160-acre ag field, which is typed to mesic savanna and mesic prairie as the target plant community for restoration. And then the third unit and this final phase that we've been working on is about 90 acres of floodplain forest in the southwestern portion of the property. I should also point out on this map that the Mississippi River is flowing along the south side of the property boundary here. And then at the eastern tip of the property, that's where the confluence of the Elk River and the Mississippi River is. So that if you ever get the chance to visit the property, that confluence is a really special spot. We should also mention that this kind of stocking-like protrusion of land east of the Houlton property across the Elk River is actually another City of Elk River property called the Bailey Point Nature Preserve, where we have recently started another grassland and savanna restoration of about 26 acres. So once we have all of that planning work done, we can go after funding, which usually includes mostly state sources, and we can get started on the restoration, which I'll kind of walk us through now. So when we began restoration at the property, most of the forests really looked like this. And so if you have a keen eye, or if you've been in a lot of degraded woodlands in Minnesota, you'll probably recognize this as buckthorn. The forests were wall-to-wall buckthorn. In some places, it was so well established that it had already self-thinned itself and formed essentially a continuous canopy. Karen and I often call this kind of an old-growth buckthorn forest. And buckthorn, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is a pretty pernicious invasive species. It shades out and outcompetes a lot of our native species, and that's not just wildflowers and grasses, but that's shrubs and the prevention of tree regeneration, so that you do not get regenerating canopy in these types of forests. And so in this photo here, you don't see a single native tree, native shrub, blooming wildflower, or really anything else that you would expect to see in a high quality forest. So the first steps are really to get rid of that invasive cover. And we use a variety of tools on lots of different projects. Definitely depends on the site and the density. But with over 150 acres of forest to tackle at the Houlton Conservation Area, we used a number of different methods. We had crews out with chainsaws and brush saws, cutting and treating stumps. But with a property this big, we needed to cover a lot of ground. And so we also used forestry mowers, which are large machines that have some kind of mulching head on the front that chew up the buckthorn and leave lots of scattered mulch all over the forest floor. And doing that allows us to cover lots of ground cost effectively, and also reduces our chemical inputs, our need for herbicides. So I have a quick video here that's going to be a little bit choppy, but I'll hit play and see if we can see this. But this is just an example of one of our restoration subcontractors, Minnesota Native Landscapes, using one of those giant forestry mowers to go through and mulch up all that buckthorn. So it's a big mulching head that really can just eat up trees, even 6 to 10 inch diameter. And it's a quick way that they can effectively remove a lot of that above ground cover. So this is essentially what that looks like in practice. You've got the area that was restored or where buckthorn was removed with forestry mowing on the right. You can see the remaining cover is pretty sparse. Those are the native trees that are still present on the site, lots of room between them. And then on the left side, you can see how dense and dark that buckthorn cover can get. And, you know, with a restoration project this big, there were lots of different tasks to deal with, many tasks that were more than Karen or I could handle on our own, but maybe too small to make it worth contracting with a large restoration subcontractor. And so we were able to incorporate volunteers and be quite impactful with their work at the site. So since 2015, we've had a large public volunteer event each spring, to do things like remove barbed wire fence lines, pull small patches of garlic mustard, haul brush, and we've even worked with the city and interested community members to establish a Friends of the William H. Houlton Conservation Area. It really helps us maintain the restoration at the property. And so here's just one more aerial view of that buckthorn removal process. You can see that all of those native trees are left standing, but they're surrounded by this sea of mulched buckthorn. And I should point out that we do almost all of this forestry mowing in the winter when the ground is frozen, so that we're not doing any damage to the native plant community. We're not rutting or creating any erosion on the site. But when you pair that with the last slide, winter really isn't the best time for volunteer events. In Minnesota, it's pretty cold. But we've been able to do some fun events at the Houlton property in areas where the forestry mowers could not reach. We had crews cut the buckthorn and had volunteers come and drag the buckthorn out of the woods and onto giant burn piles. And we were then able to host a lunch at the end of the event where we roasted s'mores and hot dogs and had a good time. So don't tell me that hauling buckthorn can't be fun. But after 3 years of mowing and follow-up treatments, this image is kind of what we are working towards and looking to see. So you can see that, again, the site is really open. Trees are freed up to grow without competition from buckthorn. And then native understory plants are beginning to recover as well. And we don't just rely on the native seed bank, because oftentimes that is quite depleted. So we've supplemented that with native seeding efforts to provide more cover, to provide diversity, to provide habitat and resources for wildlife, and also to be a competitive source with any buckthorn seedlings that are still coming up out of that seed bank. So we're really happy with the results, but maintenance in these woodland areas is certainly ongoing. And as long as there's buckthorn surrounding the property, we'll have to continue to manage it, which is the reality of most of our restoration projects in the metro. So I want to move on to kind of the focal point of the entire property, which is the 160-acre agricultural field. It's been soybean and corn rotation for over 100 years. And now, along with the areas that once held the homestead and various other barns and buildings on the property, we have about 180 acres total that we're converting from either ag use or turf grass use or degraded grassland use to native prairie and oak savanna. And Karen and I always lament that when we're out in the field taking pictures with our cell phone cameras, that images never really do it justice. But we are lucky at the Houlton site to have some cool drone photos of the site taken by one of our volunteers. And the hope is that this kind of gives you some perspective of real enormity of this place. And this is about in the center of the agricultural field. We're looking south at the Mississippi River there. And if you remember back to where I showed that landscape context map at the beginning, I mentioned that there were 2 properties just south of the Houlton Conservation Area where we have pretty high biodiversity significance. And that is this island on the left side of the property. This is actually owned by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. This is a DNR scientific and natural area, and it's part of a chain of islands called the Mississippi Islands SNA. So by restoring this sort of low quality habitat right next to a high quality piece, we're doing our part to sort of improve this corridor building effort. And we're benefiting both resident and migratory species along this stretch of the river. So here's a view of the field during our prep work. So this is early winter, early December of 2017. And you may notice here that half of the field looks worked up, that darker half on the right side. And we worked that part up for broadcast seeding. But then that other half on the left is still covered in the same stubble that was left after the soybean harvest. And that's not an accident. And this is also not a picture sort of halfway through. We did this because our funding was actually able to help us incorporate a restoration research experiment into our work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the gist is that on the right side, we broadcast all the native plant seed, and the left side, we used a drill seeding method. So why would we do that? Well, before this started, we went out and polled a variety of the statewide conservation organizations, folks at the DNR, folks at MnDOT, Great River Greening, watershed districts, and we wanted them to tell us about basically their biggest unanswered questions they have about prairie restoration. And 2 main themes really emerged. The first was that people wanted to know whether there was a diversity level of native seeding efforts over which we're essentially wasting money. We're throwing money at really expensive seed mixes and not seeing results. So we know that historically, many of our native prairies, and you can see this in some of the remnants even that Karen mentioned, like the Hastings sand coulee, we know that these prairies supported 100, 150 species in that vegetative layer. But in restoration efforts, it's really rare that we're able to take a site to that level of diversity. Whether we're starting with a degraded grassland or an ag field like this, it's pretty common that the same suite of 30, 40, maybe, if you're lucky, 50 species will eventually show themselves on the site. And that's even after many years of prescribed burns and maintenance. So we're wondering if there is a level of diversity at which it doesn't make sense to seed. And then the second thing is that we know that most people prefer a broadcast seed or a drill seed as their method. And there's reasons why you would do one or the other, but people were quite curious how diversity interacts with those seeding methods and whether there's a way that by using one or the other, we could maximize the diversity that we see in our seed mixes. So what we did is create a sort of factorial experiment here where we had 3 seed mixes. So on the western portion of the property, we used a 70 species mixture. in the central portion of the property, a 50 species mixture, and on the eastern portion of the property, a 30 species mixture. And each of those mixtures was seeded half by broadcasting and half by drill seeding, so that we have 6 different seeding blocks, all just under 50 acres. And we're going to be monitoring these over time to see how these communities differentiate, or whether these communities differentiate, and how each of these community types do at providing habitat for things like pollinators and grassland birds. So we don't yet have many results from that. The prairie still just finished its 3rd growing season, after which we expect to see a lot more differentiation, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I just wanted to show a couple images of the process, what this looks like. So this image is one of our subcontractors filling the hopper of their broadcast seeder with native seed. We used well over a ton of native seed at this property, cost well over $100,000. So this is no joke when it comes to the size and the scale of this. So this is a cold morning in December. You can see kind of frost on the ground there. And the seed that goes into that hopper is going to be dispersed through those seeding tubes and deposited on the soil surface. Oftentimes we'll follow up that seeding method, that broadcast seeding method, with a roller or packer to kind of smooth that in and push that into the soil. But here is that seeder moving across the field. It does 50% of the seeding in one direction, 50% in the other. That helps us kind of avoid that row cropping look that you can sometimes get when you're using a drill seeder. And again, this image just kind of provides a view of the enormous scale of this site. So it's probably no surprise that seeding this prairie took many, many days. And we were really lucky as part of this process to get to work with a number of different partners, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we worked with them to identify and actually recreate some historical wetlands on the property. So based on a lot of the aerial photo work that we did, looking at historical aerial photos, we identified some areas that likely had wetland soils present. And then we went out with Fish and Wildlife Service biologists to do some soil sampling. And we found a couple spots where buried below 18 and 24 inches of agricultural soil, we had still wetland soils existing there. And so we were able to do what we call wetland scrapes, where we pull off that, up to 2 feet of soil that has filled in over a century of farming. We were able to peel that back, expose those wetland soils, and also do some supplemental seeding. And we were really, really happy that in the first spring, after doing this in the fall in conjunction with our seeding in December, this wetland was teeming with life. So we had tadpoles, frogs, turtles, herons, all sorts of stuff. And it's sort of a testament to that phrase, if you build it, they will come. So here's a picture of the first year. I think this is one that went up on the website announcement for this talk. And in year 1, 2018, we were already ahead of schedule. So we had almost complete plant coverage in the spring of that year. This is from seeding in December of 2017. And this is replacing what would have been bare soil and later rows of crops throughout the year. And so you can see in the center of this picture, there's a little bit of open water, and that long sort of finger-like projection is that wetland scrape that we did. You can see it's kind of filling in with vegetation. So we were really happy with the first year, but we know, because of how we need to do maintenance mows and other things, we knew that the prairie wouldn't be providing excellent habitat yet. But by the second year, things were looking pretty good. We had areas of pretty tall cover where grasses like big bluestem and Indian grass were getting pretty tall and going to seed. We had patches like the one you see here that were dominated by pretty normal species like black-eyed Susans and wild bergamot, but still better than, again, bare soil or crops when it comes to providing habitat. So that was last year, and things were already looking pretty good. And then let's go to this year. And in the third year of our prairie restoration projects is usually when we like to bring back prescribed fire. So I'm sure most people here know that fire was sort of a historical disturbance regime that maintained prairies, both natural fires caused by lightning strikes and other means, as well as man-made fires. Indigenous people in Minnesota and all over the nation used fire to manage wildlife and to manage vegetation. But the key is that a lot of these prairie plants are adapted to fire. And things like annual weeds and woody species are not, save for bur oak and some other fire-tolerant species. So we use fire for a number of different reasons. We use it to manage those annual weeds, to keep those from going to seed and creating problems in our new restorations. We do it to maintain a woody-free coverage, so keep woody species from encroaching and then eventually starting to shade out the prairie. And then again, because prairie species are adapted to fire, we use it to invigorate our prairie plant species. So there are studies that show that when you burn in that growing season post-burn, prairie plants produce more seed and higher quality, more viable seed. So it's a way that we can sort of help that prairie perpetuate itself. So in that third year, the year we burn, that's sort of really when we say that after that, the prairie is now established and is coming into its own. So here's a kind of expansive photo, again, taken by a drone shot of what that burn looks like. And so this is just showing 1/3 of that prairie burned. And you can see, I don't know if my mouse really shows up here on these photos, but there's a thin line that's running through the middle of the tan unburned section, sort of long ways from end to end. And that is a fire break where the crew is then going to burn the southern third of the prairie. But we leave that central third unburned, and we'll actually be burning that this coming spring in 2021. And we do that, we burn in portions to leave refugia for a lot of the prairie species that need this kind of coverage. So insects that nest in prairie grasses, birds and mammals that would otherwise be displaced or removed from the site if we burned the whole thing at once. So at all of Karen's prairie restoration sites, all of my prairie restoration sites, we strive to leave refugia by not burning the whole site in 1 year. But so again, when we're talking about an established prairie, so after this third year and after the final burn next season, we really kind of move from thinking about establishing or getting that prairie going, and we can really start thinking more about how that prairie is performing. And so I kind of touched on the idea of if you build it, they will come, meaning if we're providing good, diverse vegetative habitat, then of course pollinators and birds and mammals are going to use it. But we don't really know that unless we're collecting data on that. So we need to be collecting data on how populations are changing. And for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on three groups here: reptiles and amphibians, pollinators, and then I'll turn it over to Karen to talk some about our bird surveys. And we were awarded some funding from Sea Life of Minnesota, which is why their logo is up here. And we contracted with a wildlife consulting company called Wildlife Research Consulting Services to help us carry out our surveys, given the enormity of the property and the amount of time that it'll take to do these surveys really well. But to get good data on trends, you also need to have some kind of starting point. And it would be easy for us to say, well, the property really provided no habitat when we started because it was just a crop field. But we know that a number of species, especially generalists, have adapted to use ag fields. But we were lucky to partner with the Elk River High School and a really awesome teacher there to have his students conduct pre-restoration surveys of a whole host of different things of the property. So they looked at things like water quality, invertebrates, reptiles and amphibians, and they even designed and carried out their own research projects at the property, which were really, really cool. And while data collected by high schoolers isn't incredible, let's say, it's a start, and it helps us figure out our baselines. And so they did find that a number of species were using the property, but I want to focus on the results of our post-restoration surveys, which are quite a bit better. So we, again, talking about sort of a few groups here, we had different survey methods for each group. So for a lot of our frog species, we looked at spring frog call surveys. So we went out and put recorders out at night to capture frog calls. We did that strategically in places where we knew or we thought there would be good amphibian habitat at the property. And then for reptiles and amphibians using the prairie, as well as small mammals, we put out cover boards and did cover board surveys. And for anyone unfamiliar with cover boards, what that means is just, it's a piece of material. It could be a carpet square, it could be a square of plywood, it could be corrugated tin or metal sheeting. And basically it just needs to be something that provides a basking resource, so something that reptiles can get on top of and sun themselves, or a sheltering resource that things can hide under to escape predation. So we had about 36 cover boards, paired cover boards out in the prairie that we checked twice a month. And then finally we had meander surveys through each of those different seed mix installations in our prairie, as well as a meander survey through the woodland to look at pollinators. And so what did we find? Well, you know, we found some pretty normal species, as you would expect. Toads were using the property, northern leopard frogs were using the property. We were really excited to see Cope's gray tree frog, for example, which even though it's a relatively common species, it's a cool one to find. But I think our most exciting discovery when it came to reptiles and amphibians was that we found prairie skinks at the property. And these are prairie obligate species, meaning that they need prairie habitat. They need a mix of some open ground and some short grass vegetative cover. So it was kind of unexpected that we would find these, and we hadn't found them in pre-restoration surveys. But it's unlikely also that they just knew that in the first year of the restoration that this was good habitat, so they came running from all over the place. It's more likely that they were there persisting somewhere at the property and that we're providing usable habitat for them to expand their populations, which is really, really cool to see for us. We also found red-bellied snakes and plenty of garter snakes, but the red-bellied snake is Minnesota's smallest snake species, so that was an interesting and cool find. And then obviously we found tons of butterfly species and bee species as well. And I just wanted to include a few photos because they're so striking. So species like the star-spangled fritillary. We found a number of sulfurs out there. This one is the clouded sulfur, which is a really beautiful striking butterfly with sort of pink rings around its yellow wings. We found the eastern-tailed blue. And then we also found a number of bumblebee species. Aside from the common eastern bumblebee, we found black and gold bumblebees. And I know everybody's already thinking about it. Did they find rusty patch bumblebees? No, we didn't find rusty patch bumblebees yet. But they are present and recorded in Sherburne County. And so we hope that we're providing habitat that they'll eventually be able to reach and use. But we did find the yellow bumblebee, which is another prairie species that's also a species of greatest conservation need in Minnesota. So it's not yet endangered, but it is threatened. And so it's great to see that that was able to use the property. So we've done these surveys for the last 2 years, 2018, that first year of restoration, and 2019. And it was really interesting to look at the trends or the changes from year to year. And so that first year, when we were just establishing some cover, essentially, we only found 4 different bumblebee species. Not a lot, but you know, they were around the property. But moved to 2019, where we start providing more floral resources for pollinators, and we jumped up to 16 bumblebee species. Just individual numbers, we only found 16 bumblebees in that first year. So really, really few, and it's sort of surprising that it was 16 bumblebees from 4 different species. But again, jumping from 2018 to 2019, we increased from 16 to 575. And that's not saying that those are the only bees out there, but those were the bees encountered in our transect, in our meander survey. So there's quite a much bigger number out there, but that's sort of a sampling of what we saw. And then for butterflies, the same kind of trends. We went from 15 species of butterfly in 2018 up to 25 species in 2019. So we're really happy about these trends. We hope that these continue as the prairie matures. We're really happy about those obligate species, prairie skinks, yellow bumblebees, and we hope we're providing habitat for species like the rusty patch bumblebee. But so I am gonna pass it back to Karen now to talk a little bit about the results of our bird surveys.
Okay. Half of the slide is there. Is the other half coming up? Maybe it just didn't show up on my side. So the breeding bird surveys, I thought I had into a slide. I'll start out, yeah. So give a little background here. You are probably aware that grassland bird species are among the most imperiled throughout the state and the region. And at least one of the causes of that is loss of habitat. So when the Houlton farm was protected, we were especially excited about the opportunity to convert so many acres to prairie. You know, it's something that just doesn't happen very often in an urban area. And so we were eager to see what kind of grassland birds might come back to the site. So because, you know, while restoring a native prairie vegetation is important and valuable just by itself, we also want to know what kind of habitat it provides for the wildlife. We want to know that it's making a difference for them. And so we conducted a breeding bird survey, both before the restoration while it was in cropland, and then afterwards. And we also surveyed the surrounding woodland areas. And so I just want to, before I go any further, I just want to make a note that in contrary to Gordon's nice comments, I'm not an ornithologist. I do like birds. I like to survey birds. So this is not like a super rigorous scientific study. This is like a side project of our normal restoration work. And it's just a means for us to, you know, better evaluate how our restorations are doing. So just a little caveat there. So we use standard point count methods. And so we had 4 points that were in the 160 acre cropland area, and then 3 points in the wooded area. And if you're not familiar with point counts, basically it's points are spaced 250 meters apart. And the circles that you see here are 50 meters from the center of the point itself. And so we survey, we kind of break up the survey a little bit. So we record species that we see and hear within 50 meters, and then also anything that we hear and see beyond that. So we have kind of an idea of like what is specifically within the habitat and then what might be beyond it. And this is what's typically used in other kinds of surveys as well. So our information could potentially be used by other researchers. So the first survey was, like I said, in 2016, while the site was still being cropped. And then restoration began that year and continued over the next 3 years. So we didn't do any surveys during those 3 years because basically the sites were being very disturbed. They were being mowed constantly. And so it wasn't really very reflective of, proper habitat for the birds, the prairie species. So then the second survey that we did was actually just completed this last year in 2020. That was in the time the bird was in, the prairie was in its third growing season, and about half of it had been burned that spring, as Alex mentioned earlier. And in the woodland area, when we started in 2016, what had very dense, mature buckthorn, as you saw from Alex's pictures. And then by 2020, that buckthorn was basically gone from the shrub layer, but the seedlings were still there, about a 2-foot sort of carpet around the site. The canopy had also changed pretty significantly, the tree canopy, because there had been a major windstorm in 2017, and we lost a bunch of large cottonwood and other trees. So the canopy did open up quite a bit. So then here's our results from the cropland to prairie restoration. And not surprisingly, the site supported many more grassland species after it was restored than it did before. When it was cropland, there were only 6 species that we detected. And then after restoration, that number nearly tripled to 16. And the number of birds detected more than doubled. And then, of course, the primary bird group that we saw after restoration was sparrows and swallows. Before restoration, we did not find any species of greatest conservation need. And then after restoration, we now have had 3 species there. And that total number of individuals of those species of conservation need was 21 birds, and that represented 24% of all the bird species, the bird numbers of birds detected. So that seemed pretty significant to us that, almost a quarter of the birds that we found were, really birds that really and whose population are declining. So there was one species that we did lose from our initial cropland survey, and that was the horned lark. They require more bare ground or very sparse vegetation. So once you put it into prairie, it's not really the right place for them, but they do have lots of other places to nest in the landscape. So they're not a species of concern. And then we also noticed that there are quite a few species that we would have expected to find at a prairie that were not there. Things, like a field sparrow. There weren't any field sparrows. Henslow sparrows often show up, especially early in the restoration process. We didn't have any clay-colored sparrows. So there are a few others like that, but this is really pretty much just the first year that it was mature prairie, and then half of it was burned. So we're really expecting that we're going to see more species show up as the years go by. And then we have our woodland surveys results. And these results are a little bit less conclusive and maybe a little less positive. We saw the same number of individual birds, but there were 11 fewer species in 2020 after restoration, about 24% fewer species. And of particular note was woodpeckers. We really kind of lost out on a lot of woodpeckers. And so that might just be a factor of, losing more trees and losing even the shrubs themselves, the buckthorn shrubs, which had become tree size. Only 2 of the woodland species we found were species of conservation need, and one of those, the yellow-billed cuckoo, was recorded in both years. So we're wondering, why did we see fewer species in 2020? Not conclusive. We don't really know for sure. It might just be that the dramatic changes to that woodland would have shifted the species composition. And we just don't have, it's still in the process of being restored. And maybe, we're missing that shrub layer entirely. So it's very possible that we just don't have the structure there that ultimately that will be there and that would support more species. And then we also have to remember that this is a snapshot in time. We usually, want to do our bird surveys several years and to get better information. And so that's what we're going to be doing. We'll have another survey next year. And then I couldn't leave you without at least showing you a few of these wonderful bird species that you will now have said goodbye to for 2020. But we'll look for them again next year. Bobolink, we did find one of those this year. And I should be quizzing you guys. What is this? Savanna sparrow. And last but not least, grasshopper sparrow. So in summary, oh, and then I forgot, we do the yellow-billed cuckoo as well. And this one we got to see really close, like almost that close. That was really awesome. It's really a fun bird to see. You just don't see them, all that often. So it's always great. Next slide, Alex. Oh, I don't have a next slide. Okay. I'll just summarize real quick then. Actually, I won't summarize because I already just told you everything. We had more dramatic increase in the numbers of individuals and the numbers of species in the grassland after prairie restoration, and less positive and less pronounced effects in the woodland. I don't know what happened to our slide, Alex, but that's okay.
Well, either way, I'm super appreciative of Karen's ability as a birder because I am not a birder. So she covers at the sites what I cannot. And so it was really cool to have her conducting these both pre and post restoration surveys to look at some of these trends, just like we did with the other species. So I kind of wanted to leave folks with a couple takeaways before we wrap up here. This is, mostly from our surveys themselves. We were surprised right away that in the first year of restoration of that prairie that we saw a greater abundance of wildlife than we really could have imagined for a first year restoration, which I think, may speak to the surrounding landscape being a good habitat for them already, or it may speak to the need for more quality habitat so that species are essentially ready to use newer habitat. And we're trending upwards, at least in the prairies, of both abundance and diversity of the wildlife we surveyed. So that was really heartening to see, and we hope that those trends continue and hope they continue for some of these rarer prairie obligate species, things like prairie skinks and bumblebees, and hopefully we get that rusty patch bumblebee pretty soon. So we expect these populations to expand as the prairie matures, but like Karen said, we'll continue to do these surveys and see. So we want at least 4 to 5 years of good data, even post-restoration. And as we said before, the prairie is generally thought to be kind of established after that 3rd year, but even that prescribed burn year can be a bit strenuous for a lot of the species that use the property. So we want a few more years of surveys to see how it's performing post-establishment. But so far we're pretty happy. So just, apparently, at least with our data, it's a good idea ultimately to turn row crop systems into diverse prairie systems. And that's not just for wildlife, but that's for water quality as well. And so where appropriate, we are going to continue doing this kind of restoration. So I wanted to leave you with the fact that this property is completely open to the public. It's managed by the city of Elk River as a conservation area. It's open year-round. Like a scientific and natural area, there are no official trails, but there is a path that sort of rings the perimeter of the entire property on the edge of the prairie. So it's a great place to visit. It's a great place to meander, great place to bird, to botanize. And as Gordon mentioned, it's not far from other great places like Sherburne. So you can find the address on Google Maps, and you can come out next spring and see year 4 of the prairie. So I think that's all we have. And I think we're going to turn it over for questions, but we were asked to show one more thing. I know that St. Paul Audubon is keenly interested in the Mississippi River critical area ordinances, especially in St. Paul. And for anyone unfamiliar with this, basically it's a process where 25 cities and townships that are along the Metro Mississippi are writing and finalizing their ordinances that ultimately govern development along the river and aim to protect the Mississippi riverfront. So St. Paul's guidelines, their ordinances, should be finalized in the next 6 to 9 months. And there's going to be a public input process, but this is as good a time as any to start pushing for bird safety measures in the St. Paul ordinance. So our river corridor director wanted us to pass along that, keeping in mind things like development heights, requirements for bird safe glass, etc. Neither Karen nor I are experts on the ordinance process, so there is the link there, that URL, if you want to learn more about it. I think that link also contains the contact info of our river corridor director. So I think that's it. I can stop screen sharing here and we can take some questions.
There are some questions on the chat line, Alex, if you want to take a look at those. I think they're mostly directed at you.
Let me try to bring that up. I can't see it when I'm sharing my screen. So
I'll step in. Thank you first. That was exceptional, both of you. Looks like a small road trip in my future, sooner than later. Yeah, we had a number of questions. Many of them have to do with buckthorn. I think all of us have pulled buckthorn at some point or another, and it just comes back. So what's kind of the management plan moving forward on the forested areas and the buckthorn process? What's kind of your best practices? Or
yeah, sure. So Karen mentioned this to some extent during her surveys, but the buckthorn is by no means gone yet. And what I've already talked about is 3 or 4 years of management. So by no means is there a one-shot deal to get rid of buckthorn. You're not only dealing with that above ground material, but you're dealing with a seed bank that can last upwards of 5 years. And so there's going to be repeated germination cycles from that seed bank, and you'll have to deal with resprouts, you'll have to deal with seedlings for a number of years. So all of our, or at least most of our restoration contracts, when we can get the funding, are usually sort of 4-year time horizons, so that we can include not only that initial removal, but subsequent follow-up steps as well. So no matter how you go about your initial removal, and if it's on your own property, maybe that's a combination of weed wrenching, maybe it's some cut and paint removal where you're using a chainsaw or a bow saw to cut the stump down at the ground level and paint on some kind of herbicide. Invariably, you're going to need to do next steps. And we do that with a multitude of tools. We found that multiple forestry mowing on large acreages actually works to mulch up those seedlings that have germinated out in that 2nd and 3rd year. We have used herbicide late in the season to spray onto those buckthorn leaves as they remain growing late in the season past a lot of our native woodland species. But it's not something that we like to do if there's any sort of native diversity really left at the site. Karen has a number of projects where she's used goats and will continue to use goats to deal with a lot of those seedlings and resprouts that occur post-removal, which is a great non-chemical way to do it. But there's absolutely no silver bullet, and unfortunately the answer is you have to stay at it.
A lot of work. All right. Second question. Well, early on, you talked about what vegetation was there in the 16, 1700s, 1800s. How do you come up with that kind of data?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting process that if anyone's heard of the Marshner maps, they're basically maps that mapped out pre-settlement vegetation as the state of Minnesota was being settled. So at every 40-acre interval at every corner, they looked at what tree species they encountered during their surveys. And by denoting a tree species in their gridded plat surveys, they could then start to point out and sort of put together the dominant vegetation type in each area. So by pointing out every dominant tree at each of those 40 acres, you can start to kind of have a boundary where you outline, okay, well, this forest type is maybe big woods, maple basswood forest that we see down around Nerstrand. Or there were no trees at our survey intervals for miles and miles, meaning that the site was likely a prairie dominated landscape. And so they actually created these statewide maps that show their best guesses at the delineation of these habitat types. So it's by no means an exact science, because we know that different tree species can grow, in different habitat types, but it's their best stab at an approximation of the boundaries of these communities as they existed historically. So you can go online and look up these maps and see what your property or your favorite site might have looked like 200 years ago.
Very cool. We have a question: is hunting allowed on the property, or will it be? I would assume if that's Elk River City. Yeah.
It is allowed. So that was actually something that because we used, or to be more accurate, I mentioned the Trust for Public Lands was a partner here. So they put up a lot of the money that was used to actually purchase the property before it was deeded to the city. And because of that, money used from the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund comes with a number of stipulations, including that you can't have buildings or developments on the property, but also that it needs to be open to hunting or fishing. And so we actually worked with the DNR to create a hunting plan for the property, which was quite difficult given that it's essentially located just southwest of downtown Elk River, and that there are houses along the periphery. So the property is open to every normal season, but it's archery only for the majority of it, except a belt along the Mississippi River where it's open for shotgun hunting for waterfowl only. The DNR also leads a few special hunts for youth groups, and the property is posted when that happens, but it is open for hunting season. So when you go out and explore, you should make sure to keep track of those posted seasons.
Gotcha. We have, and I'll just read it. Were there drain tiles in the fields, and did you have to remove any drain tiles where the ponds were created?
Surprisingly enough, there were no drain tiles on the entire property. There was one drain tile that drained the kind of the homestead area, and the area where all the barns were, and that led to the Elk River, and that's kind of the northern section of the property. But where we did those wetland scrapes, those were historical oxbows of the Elk River. So those were areas where the river historically kind of meandered into what is now that ag field. And so we didn't have to do any kind of changes to the hydrology other than scraping off that soil. And in 2019, in fact, the water levels were so high in the spring that the Elk River actually reconnected with that wetland scrape, and we got tons of common carp stuck in that wetland. So you know, there's always management challenges that you can't anticipate.
Cool. Let's see, somebody posted the address. We've got that. Are the Houltons still around? The gentleman who owned the property?
Yes. So what was really interesting about our natural resource management planning process is that, I mean, we try to do as deep a dive as possible into how the property was used historically to find out, you know, which portions were grazed, which portions were used for this or that activity. And we didn't talk to any Houlton family member, but a lot of the younger generations of the family did come to the property dedication ceremony.
Very cool.
So the folks who were alive at the time that it was really booming as an agricultural site were no longer around, but the family still was. They just were no longer in farming. But the interesting and really fun thing for me was I got to go interview a woman named Lucille Abraham, and she and her husband actually ran the farm for about 40 years in the early 1900s. She was 91 years old. I went to her living room in Elk River, sat down. She showed me old photos of the property. She told me where kids used to run their snowmobiles.
Sure.
I got all sorts of insight that was actually quite helpful in figuring out how this property was used and how it might be best restored.
Very cool. That's just fun. I didn't realize it's really right at the dam, right?
Yep. So that dam is Lake Orono there. That's the dammed portion of the Elk River, and then flows not far down to the confluence.
Which by there dozens of times on bike rides and never had a clue.
Well, there's a parking lot there now, and I think it can accommodate like 12 or 14 cars. So as long as you're not there at the beer opener, you'll usually have the place to yourself.
If there's any, look at the maps. Anyone else questions? That was exceptional.
So I see one about the wetlands, sort of what has happened with them.
Yep.
And I kind of mentioned that, you know, we had this interesting flood last year that kind of reconnected. We have really great establishment of native vegetation, and some of that we seeded, and some of that was from the historical wetland seed bank, which was persisting underneath that soil that we then scraped away. We see every year thousands and thousands of tadpoles using it. Herons are wading in there, eating the tadpoles. We had snapping turtles in there this year. So it's just pretty stellar habitat. What you can't really see on this aerial is there's one more smaller wetland scrape towards the southeast corner of the ag field that doesn't provide the same kind of open water habitat, but it's just a really small, I think it's like 0.1 acre. You can kind of see it start to show up as, yep, exactly right there. So that was another scrape. And then, so we'll continue managing those, but we were really lucky that we didn't get much in the way of reed canary grass coming back, which was an issue there prior to restoration. So we've been really lucky with these wetlands.
Thank you, both of you. Gordon, any other thoughts, questions, anyone?
There is a question on pheasants or prairie chickens. You know, I don't think we heard pheasants. I don't recall getting them on the survey. And no, prairie chickens would not be in this part of the state, unfortunately. They'll be northwest, pretty much, or western part of the state.
Yeah, this is Gordon Anderson. By the way, I'm on the St. Paul Audubon Speaker Committee, which is why I'm on this call. Although it was good, really good, I would have been on anyway. But one thing about Elk River, I was up there to do a volunteer thing at this very property this spring, and it's tricky finding it. I didn't use Google Maps. I was driving around. Anyway, I found it. But yeah, it's a really interesting site, and this is amazing work. So FMR, congratulations on restoring soybeans to prairie that's actually functioning as a prairie and providing so much habitat now. So probably in subsequent years, you'll find even more species of everything, pollinators, birds, and prairie skinks. So more prairie skinks.
It is kind of funny that, it's this huge site and it's basically in downtown Elk River, and you think, well, you couldn't possibly miss it, but it's weirdly tucked away.
Yeah. Yeah,
drive by
the street names change. I think that always throws me off when you're driving along and suddenly it's a different name.
Yeah.
Well, it's a residential neighborhood that bumps into a river. I mean, runs into a dam.
Yeah.
Other than one extra driveway, you almost wouldn't know it exists. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Alex is on Google Maps here right now, showing us exactly where it is. Unless that's Karen, but
that's me. That's
oh, that's Ben. There he is, the webmaster. Yeah.
I like playing with maps.
And FMR, they're one of the big conservation organizations in the state, so they're always looking for more volunteers for work projects and also for more members too. So.
Thank you, Gordon.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you really, the view, you'd almost just wouldn't know it's there.
I noticed you had cliff swallows in your census.
A lot.
When I was there this spring, there were just a whole colony of cliff swallows under the bridge there.
Oh.
And of course, I didn't know they were there. And I thought, man, I could spend a couple hours here photographing cliff swallows instead of going up to Sherburne, which I did after leaving Houlton. But I think that one or two birds you saw on the prairie were just flying around from the dam, probably.
Oh, there were dozens. That's all we saw. We saw dozens and dozens and dozens of cliff swallows.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the numbers in your charts weren't individuals. It was.
Well, it was both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was the number of individuals, but.
Well, it was species, I guess, but. Because there was 1 and 2s there, and I thought, well, yeah, the barn swallow too came from, anyway.
Yeah.
But
we had 32 cliff swallows in our survey. That's just within the points themselves, and that was this year. So.
Yeah, they were very busy making nests under that bridge.
I was wondering where they were. I didn't know where they were nesting, but
yeah, I just noticed them.
Okay.
I was coming in and out of the parking lot, I think.
Yeah.
But maybe a lot of the grassland birds will be back too, and even more species. So you didn't see bobolink there though, have you? I don't think so.
You were not paying attention, Gordon.
Well, I saw your picture, but I didn't remember seeing it.
One or two.
Yes, there was one. There was just one bobolink this year.
One male?
One male. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well maybe next year there'll be more.
Yes, I know.
I missed it on your chart. I did see the picture.
Yep, that was one of the 3 species of conservation need. I should have called that out. We had the grasshopper sparrow, dickcissel, and bobolink.
Okay.
We'll be out to see you in the spring, or out to see the property in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. And Ben, do you want to, next month, our meeting is
oh, yeah.
Dr. Sushma Reddy, who's the Breckenridge Chair of Ornithology at the Bell Museum. And she'll be speaking about the birds of Madagascar. That's her research area. So she's way into the taxonomy and the genomic analysis of all the birds of Madagascar.
Wow.
So that will be next month, November.
Yep. Just on the event calendar, they're going up to Creek Meadow, and this is right. Yeah.
And she did speak at the MOU meeting last December, and it was quite interesting. But this will be available to everybody. You don't have to go to the MOU meeting. You just sit at home and watch it.
So is that the 5th then, Gordon?
It's always the second Thursday, so that would be
It's 7.
That's the 12th.
the 12th, November 12th.
And it looks like we've got tonight's recorded, so hopefully we'll have that up tomorrow on the website. So if you've got somebody that wants to see it that wasn't able to join us tonight, we should have that up tomorrow.
Okay. Well, we had, I think we had
Thank you, everybody.
44 people, I think.
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
this was great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
And thanks, Gordon, for organizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it was a good one.
That's great.
It worked out.